Hello, I'm Mike Buchanan, leader of the political party Justice for Men and Boys and the Women Who Love Them. I'm also the conference director and very pleased to say the conference is going sensationally smoothly. My co-host for this interview is Philip Tanzer, a well-known German MRA who lives in the very far north of Scotland. Anything north of where Philip lives and you're in the sea, basically. I think that's right to say, isn't it, Philip? He's a member of Gender Parity.
Actually, when you look at on old maps, it says beyond here there be dragons.
Yes. by which they presumably meant Nicola Sturgeon. But that's south of you, so that makes no sense at all. Our interviewee today is Professor Dennis Hayes. Dennis is Professor of Education at the University of Derby and Director of the influential campaign group Academics for Academic Freedom. He's also on the advisory board of the Free Speech Union, of which I'm a member, and great organization. I've got to say, £5 a month, an absolute steal for the work they're doing. So I strongly recommend people, wherever they live in the world, contribute, become members. Dennis, a very warm welcome.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to it.
So,
Let's
Philip,
have some questions.
Yes, Philip, you got a question there?
Well, I do have a question, but Douglas has already submitted the first one, which is a great question. Can a society legally protect itself from the promotion of unsociable behavior, for example, from incitement to violence to hate speech, and yet legally support free speech?
Well, free speech is free and hate speech is free speech. So I don't think society really, when you say society should protect itself, presumably that means the government should protect itself rather than people. I take the view that we're in a situation where ordinary people and ordinary campaigns have lost momentum. We've seen the collapse of trade unions, we've seen the collapse of political parties. So it just seems you've just got to rely on the state in some way. So whatever the state decides to do, you have to do it. And I think the new, in the UK, or in England and Wales anyway, the new freedom of speech in higher education bill is an example of what I'm talking about, because a lot of academics and others have given up on one another. They don't trust themselves anymore. They don't trust their own ability to organise and defend free speech and everything else they value, like the freedom to participate in marches and to express yourself in various ways. So they feel that we've got to have the state in to tell you to be free. And I've said many times that's not freedom, that's servitude. If the state has to tell you to be free, you're not free.
We have another question from Douglas. In fact, we have another. Sorry, Philip.
Just a second. Could I ask a follow-up question?
Of course.
Would you not say that it is one of the core duties of the government to protect the rights or freedoms of people, to create a society where people can actually be as free as possible? Would you not see that as one of the core principle or core duties of the government?
Well, the government usually does what it feels that people are going to demand of it. So that's the case. I mean, if you take the First Amendment to the Constitution in America, to make no laws infringing freedom of the press or freedom of speech. And that was when a country was being founded, through struggle and through a lot of debate and discussion about what it should be. And that comes out. But what's happened since? It's a constant attempt to keep that value and uphold it, whereas free speech is under as much threat in the United States as it is in any other country that hasn't got a constitution like that. So when you say that, I mean, it's sort of, we don't leave it up to people, we'll give it to the government. But the government tends to just do one thing that I really find objectionable, which is putting lots of buts. So when you have the government says, yes, we'll defend your right to free speech, and then there'll be lots and lots of exceptions. When we founded the AFAF campaign in 2006, we took out of the FF statement freedom within the law, free speech and academic freedom within the law, because there were so many restrictions within the law. Hate speech being one of the newest ones, but there were many more. Almost, you can have free speech, but not if it infringes any of the equality duties or responsibilities. So constantly there are restrictions by governments on free speech. So although they may start off quite well, usually it gets so compromised that it is next to worthless. And the only reason, this is such a popular view, don't we need governments to do this? Simply because we haven't got the groundswell of people who are fighting for those values. I mean, equality, the irony about a lot of this is that the battle is often between the government defending equality and all the protected characteristics and free speech. Whereas in the past, it was people who were arguing for equality that used free speech, just as, you would do if you were defending men's rights or anything else. You've got to argue for things. You cannot just rely on the government. And I think what will happen with new laws is that people will just become passive. And the only time I remember being really annoyed about this and being called an anarchist was I gave a talk in Zurich, and there was a member of the European Commission on the panel, and she was absolutely outraged that I didn't believe that, they were defending our free speech. And she actually called me an anarchist. It's not often I've been called an anarchist, but my trust is in people and not in the state, and that creates difficulties when people are being more passive than they have for a long time. They're passive because there's not much in government for them to support.
Okay, come on to...
In regards to you...
Go on, Philip.
In regards to those who were actually fighting for equality used free speech, and now they want to restrict free speech, or the government protects them from free speech. I think that is in some ways what Douglas Murray is talking about in regards to equality, that it's like a train and they want to reach equality, but they never stopped. They just kept driving off into the sunset, and now they have the power and try to oppress those who they think they were oppressed by. Would you agree with that?
I think so. They're certainly driving the train now, and I mean, when you often see it that if you take the issue of trans rights or any of the equality issues, they still present themselves as if they were oppressed. And that is no longer the case. The values they fought for are now the mainstream values, the values of every university, every government, and that makes it very difficult to challenge them because they still hide behind a cloak of oppression. I probably made this point in my talk, but if you wonder why, it's always people in the top universities, the most privileged students who complain about the statues and want to decolonize the curriculum. And you realize that I kept thinking they were just mad. It's a sort of crazy thing. But they get strength from pretending they're oppressed by finding oppression. And secondly, and I think it's something I recently thought about, is they're preparing themselves for future employment, because not only universities, but companies have gone woke. So they're not expressing weird values. They're saying, I'm employable. I want to be part of the new elite. And that gives a real solid basis to why this has happened. Otherwise, you just say, well, universities are crazy. That's what people say. It's political correctness gone mad. But I think there's a real ideological basis to it. I don't think Douglas Murray has caught on with this yet. It is the future for a lot of these people in companies that will be as woke as any university. It's all superficial. I'm not saying there's anything deep about this, but it's how you select people for the new elite, for the people who are going to be running our lives in a few years' time.
I'm sure that's right, Dennis. I'd like just to refer to something we were chatting about before we went live, which was Katheryn Stock, who was a feminist professor at the University of Sussex, I think, and recently resigned over opposition to trans women in women's centres, in women's spaces. And I must have read 10 articles by her in the mainstream media complaining about she's being silenced. Julie Bindel has written 50 pieces for The Spectator, all full of lies about domestic violence. She writes about being silenced. Well, I wish to God we were silenced in the same way.
Well, that's one of the arguments about that people who want to censor speakers often use. They will say that, you know, a university students union says we ban you, but you've got other platforms, and because we try and ban you, you know, we'll we're encouraging more debate because you'll get more attention. Well, that's maybe okay for one or two famous people, but for others, it's a disastrous thing. They don't get the possibility to do what a few people like Katheryn Stock have done, and you know, others lose their career and often lose it in a very quiet way. And if you go through our banned list that we've got, you know, a lot of those people, you know, don't work again, or they just learn to keep quiet. So it may be true about one or two people, but it's not a defense of cancelling there, I don't think. No. So in that sense, she has been silenced.
I think that even super powerful people, like, for example, J.K. Rowling, she being deplatformed or silenced, maybe you could say no, but the hit to her career is so dramatic that it forces other with far less influence to stay silent. So I think we have to defend free speech wherever it is being attacked, even if the big ones still have other ways to express themselves. Sorry,
that's true.
I didn't want to take away from you.
No, you have to defend free speech of everyone, you know, even of, you know, royals and you know, lords and ladies and anybody in power, because otherwise you're always having, you know, the thing I constantly say, people don't believe in free speech, but they'll do, I believe in free speech, but not for this person and not for that person. And once you do that, you don't believe in free speech. You know, as I said, it deletes the first part of the sentence. So hard as it is to defend some of these people sometimes, you know, you have to defend them. And J.K. Rowling, despite all her money and fame, has suffered. There's no doubt about this. I mean, she wasn't invited to the 25th anniversary of the first Harry Potter film? You say it's nothing.
Outrageous.
It becomes ridiculous. And I think that the real change, so I'll just talk forever unless somebody interrupts me, Philip, but one of the real changes that I've noticed is that it's not just what you say that gets you in trouble now, it's just defending free speech itself can get you in trouble. You know, because I used to think that I was absolutely safe defending free speech, but now defending free speech is offensive in itself, because there's this new cry, and it comes from the unions, the university and college union. There are some things that are beyond debate. As a trans argument, you know, lives might be lost, so nothing can be debated. And there's a momentum behind that about lots of issues, which will mean, you know, for this conference and other ones that you organise, you're more likely to be stopped because these are not issues that anybody wants to talk about.
Philip, over to you.
Mike. Oh, over to me, yeah. I'm going to read the question from Douglas Wallace. He's asking, at what stage of education are people being taught to care more about their feelings than for open examination of facts and debate over issues?
Well, I don't know, just publicise the book, but when we did the Dangerous Rise of Therapeutic Education, we went through everything from reception classes, nurseries, right through to preparation for retirement classes. And it's the same, you know, throughout, in every sphere of education, people are more concerned about feelings than they are about their facts and learning. And, you know, the classic thing of learning the best that's been known and thought. And if you take an example of the sort of issues that we saw in the classic circle time in a nursery or with very young children, where what would in the past have happened, you'd have read a story, you know, Beatrix Potter, or you'd have a fairy story, and you'd have talked about the characters in this. What happens now, you still sit in the circle and you talk about your own personal problems or the problems you have at home and your feelings about them. And to me, that's intrusive cruelty of the worst possible sort, because by talking about animals and stories, You know, you distance yourself from the problems. You know, Bambi dies, but it's not your grandma dying. You know, not Bambi, sorry, Bambi's mother dies. I think that's been cut out of the film now. But and then you learn about death through that. But you don't want to talk in school when you're a young child about the problems you're having at home or somebody who's ill. And to think that, and it's not just incompetence. So some people say teachers aren't trained; they don't know what they're doing. You know, this happens all the time. And you just see it in primary schools. You get the same thing. The example I always give is of one school that had a worry box. You know, everybody had to put their worries in the worry box in turn. And my friend who runs the East Midlands Salon with me, she said her daughter was crying because and didn't want to go to school. And she said, why? And the answer is, well, it's my turn to put my worries in the worry box, and I haven't got any worries. You're not allowed to be like that. Right through to university level, it's the same. You assume to have mental health problems. And the examples, the best that's known and thought to be concerned about yourself is a fundamental shift in education at all levels. And I think it's hard to see it, but it's accelerating all the time. So in universities, and you go back through schools, down to the youngest child now, everybody's learning to see the world through mental health problems. And I gave the example that, so a student coming out of a tutorial saying, oh, that really affected my mental health. You know, it's like, it's a tutorial, read more, learn more. That's not appropriate. You know, everybody's learning to do this. And as I've said, and the thing is, if you present yourself as a victim, this is the key question about this, is that if you're a victim, you can't be challenged. You know, if you present yourself as a victim, and it's something you might say about, you know, do you have, if you want to defend men's rights, do you have to present men as victims? You know, because that's the way you get attention and the way you protect yourself.
But it's, I mean, that is a quick road to depression and unhappiness, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, but then, you know, there's an army of therapists who will come and help you. That's the difficulty, you know, has been, there was a book called The Faith of the Counsellors, published in 1966, that made the point that all the professions had gone over to therapy in the UK. You know, it's therapists you went to. So you go and see a social worker, you go and see a politician, you're more likely to get therapy. And that was back in 1966. Wow. If you think about the changes that have happened since then, that's what people assume automatically you need. So you don't need rigorous debate, you need therapy. You know, and that's why we were talking before about how you can't have a debate that's for and against a topic because it seems too confrontational. Whereas, you know, self-expression is fine. Just tell me what you feel about this topic. And that's what people say to you all the time now. They don't say, what do you think or what do you know? What do you feel about this topic?
I often find at Speaker's Corner, Dennis, that if I'm having a discussion with a woman and I'm challenging her, she will accuse me of being a misogynist. And this is often a woman, sometimes a feminist, with a male partner, and the guy is just, you can just see, you know, he's not in her line of sight, but you can see the guy dying of embarrassment because that's the life he leads. He cannot challenge her.
But that's the real difficulty. If you challenge people who've challenged notions like white privilege, get accused of being racist. So, but that just means, you know, that's that argument. You're stepping beyond the pale. These things are not up for discussion, or you'll be abused. And that's why so many people get threatened. I mean, the number of people who said they get death threats all the time. You know, I don't know if you give this example, but the worst death threats I had once when I was giving a talk about religious belief, and I didn't want to offend anybody in the audience, whatever religion they were. So I picked on witchcraft. You know, and I thought, I'm safe here. You know, nobody's going to worry about the nonsense that is witchcraft. And then as I finished my talk, these three girls came storming from the back of the audience and said, I said, before you're going to speak, you're going to tell me you're witches, aren't you? Yeah. And they said, yes. And what you said was the most offensive thing we've ever heard. And then you know, I remember after doing that, you get letters, handwritten letters, you know, threatening you with all sorts of things.
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing worse than an offended witch, is there?
Well, there are a lot of witches around as it happens, but no offense to witches.
Just, you know, I'd avoid.
You can't get a safe example. That's the trouble.
No, I'd avoid black cats from now on, Dennis. That's all I can want.
Well, that is. I would like to read
No, sorry.
I'd like to read a question that Paolo Frederico posted, but he posted it into the chat, not in the Q&A section. So next time, please write it in the Q&A section. The question is, don't you think the very use of the word hate in legal law context retains an approximation which allows to distort and use at somebody's will the rules and law? In other words, what would the crime or violation be? Speak in a way that people might develop hate. This would be the listener's problem, or having hate myself, and this would be my problem.
I think that's a very good point. And I mean, hate regulations and crimes are so subjective that it almost means, you know, whoever wants to be offended by something will say that's a hateful speech, that's hateful. And I think it is exactly as the questioner said, it's about how you interpret it. But it's really, really difficult, you know, to be accused of hate when you're making points is a way of silencing people. So it means you just can't criticize anybody. So, and we talked before the session started about people who will only defend partial free speech. So they defend free speech for them, but not for other people. So, you know, I think free speech is an absolute in that way. So if you're an Israeli, you have the right to free speech. If you're a Palestinian supporter, you have the right to free speech. And each one will accuse one another of hate. You know, that's just a way of trying to silence debate, and the law is misused in that way because people, the law is, and it gets back to the point that about whether you trust the state, because people will always wheel in the state to silence you. I might say this, you know, you mustn't say anything that the state will say is illegal. I remember once criticizing the existence of dyslexia, which, you know, there is a big debate about whether dyslexia exists. It's called, guess what, the dyslexia debate. And I'm on one side of it, which is I don't believe it exists. And I was saying this, and it was in a studio where somebody else was absent. And this voice came out of the darkness saying what Dennis Hayes is saying is illegal. Right? So you know, you can't even have a debate about whether something exists without somebody accusing you of committing a crime, whether it's a hate crime or, you know, a crime that denies people. And one of the issues that you get is in debates now, there's often quite a lot of tears. You know, people cry very easily. When the book first came out, people.
Sorry, Dennis. When you say people.
Well, sorry.
Do you mean women?
Well, not necessarily. Members of the audience get very, very upset.
No, but women exclusively, or some men?
No, it has been some women, often mothers, but often people who have both male and female as happens. They may not have as many tears, but they do get very upset, and that's because they think you're doing something that isn't protective enough. So if you argue for knowledge and a real education in schools, you know, you don't seem to be doing the sort of touchy-feely things. You know, you're not encouraging building confidence, and because what they have is a two-stage theory of education. You know, you get people settled, and you get them feeling happy, and you get them feeling confident, and then you move on to knowledge. And that you hear that even at university level. I've heard people argue that people have to have confidence built up when they're PhD students to go and give a seminar. Right? So you have a confidence building course before you go and give the seminar. And I said, just go and give the seminar, and that's how you get the confidence. And while this debate was actually going on, one of my students organized an international debate. She hadn't finished a PhD, and she organized a debate on the educational legacy of colonialism. You know, and looking at both sides of it, and she had a packed lecture theatre. But you know, all the universities and all the educational systems say you can't do that until you've had a course in building confidence or whatever. And I think that, but that means it never gets there. I was looking back on one thing that Facebook does do to you, Philip, is it brings you memories. And in 10 years ago, I was in a debate, the Doha debate in Qatar, and there was Tariq Ramadan and I were on the side, education is worthless without freedom of speech. So that was the topic. And what became clear to the people who opposed us, and they actually said this, that in certain countries, certainly in the Middle East or Egypt or wherever, you couldn't have critical education straight away. You had to have two stages. You had to have basically training for years, right, for the poor people. And then at some point, we could perhaps have a critical education. I've heard that argued by Indian educationalists as well. You know, for the mass of people, you can have training, and then the elite they have critical, or the mass can have it at some time in the future. Whereas at every level of education, you can bring in critical elements, you know, even in those nursery classes I was describing, you know, but critical about what's happening in the stories, not about what's happening in your private life. Because the great thing, sorry, the great thing about
sorry, go on.
All right, just one point is that a friend who I know who was in Lebanon during the Civil War said the teachers took this line with the kids. They used to get them to line up, and as they came into the school, they give them a carrier bag, and they'd say, "Look, we know you're worried about your parents and your family and what's going on, and there's bombing, but put all your troubles in this carrier bag and come in and learn." And that's, to me, what education should be about. But now you bring all your troubles into the classroom, and that damages education fundamentally.
I'd like to pick up on the points of confidence and competence, Dennis. It's a fascinating area. I know a young lady, a beautiful Scottish lady in her 30s, who's a marketing executive, and she takes beta blockers before giving important presentations. I've got to say, when I was running teams, if it had come to my attention that somebody had to take beta blockers to do a presentation, I would have thought that person is in the wrong job. And I think that the interesting gender divide here, for me at least, I don't know if I can have your thoughts, but is that men instinctively know that confidence flows from competence, and whereas women are anxious and want confidence without acquiring the competence. First, there's also kind of, I think there's a work ethic element to it as well.
Well, the number of people I know who have to have a whiskey, who would like to have a glass of wine when they're giving to up men, because it's, you know, it does help. There's a great story in one book I read about history that said, I can't remember the name, but the author said the history lessons they had were really boring in the morning. And then his teacher went to the pub at lunchtime when you could do that. And when he came back, history came alive. And I think on power relations, I think it's not the vulnerability anymore, because in a lot of areas, like in universities, women can be very, very powerful, and they don't see themselves as victims or needing confidence building. I mean, there are networks that do that, but I think it's much easier if you're a woman to challenge now than it is if you're a man.
I think in education at the moment, especially like primary and secondary, I don't know about the universities, men are far less likely to actually be allowed to answer questions. So if girls and boys raise their hands, it's predominantly girls that are being chosen, because there is still the impression that girls are being left behind, even though data shows that that's not the case. And I think I talk to more and more boys, I'm a hairdresser and I cut their hairs, that tell me that they feel left behind in education. But these are not concerns that they can bring into the classroom when they are being asked to share their concerns, because obviously these concerns are part of the classroom. You can only complain about things that are agreed upon. So if you experience abuse at home, or if you don't feel heard at home, that's fine. But if you don't feel heard in the school as a boy, you can't actually talk about that. Would you agree with that, Dennis?
Well, I think you can talk. I mean, I think you have to see that boys get treated in the same way. I mean, to express your vulnerabilities is a way of getting power. So if you're not willing to express your vulnerabilities, then you're likely to have treatment. I mean, that is the way I see it. It's not that you're silenced, it's that you're encouraged to think differently and to.
But But if your vulnerability is actually in the classroom, because you say, actually, I feel like I'm not allowed to express myself. I'm not allowed to express myself here in the classroom openly and honestly, because that is a vulnerability that you're not allowed to express.
But that is because that's what happened to classrooms generally. I mean, the idea that you talk about what you think is not allowed. You've got to have the right sort of feelings and thoughts. That is generally true. And we talked before about, I mean, it depends how none of this would happen if people were more open. I mean, you often, at university level, I mean, we had a visiting speaker, and we had, and she said to the woman organizing it, you're just letting people ask questions. Why don't you ask some of the women to ask questions? You know, and she wouldn't do it. You know, the point being, you know, you have to stand up and ask questions. You shouldn't be shy and retiring like Claire Fox. You know, you've got to be able to speak up. And if from the moment you go into any educational setting, being able to speak freely, not just to express your feelings, which is what you're supposed to do, then we would resolve a lot of these issues. And you know, I think if debate was more common, I mean, what's called the old-fashioned debate, for and against, in universities and schools. Well, obviously, the difficulty with universities have, if all that happens in schools is self-expression and expression of your feelings, so when you come to university, something different has to happen that makes you more upset. So there's a difficulty. So I think the problem lies further down, but also universities just reinforce the fact that there are certain things you should say and certain things you should feel. And I think mandatory training in things like consent and, you know, and unconscious bias and so on is part of that, makes saying there are only certain things you're allowed to think and feel, you know, white privilege. So but it all depends how it's handled. And I think if you're brave enough, you can challenge all these things within the system. You know, I still make the point that we won the battle at my university at Derby to on things like unconscious bias, to deal with them through debate rather than just telling you what to think. I think that's the challenge we have in schools. So they shouldn't be telling you what to think about any issue. I wouldn't exclude any topic. I know Philip mentioned things that we wouldn't allow in schools, but you know, I think those topics will get in even if they're not mandated by a policy and curriculum. But if there's always the possibility to challenge, then you know, it doesn't matter what's going on in schools, really. And I think
Dennis, sorry, we have about 20 minutes left and quite a few more questions. Very good questions. So Sean G asks, in the grievance studies affair 2017 to 18, spoof papers peppered with fashionable jargon were accepted for publication and subsequent citation by supposedly serious journals such as Feminist Glaciology. I like it. Yeah. Such academia looks and is utterly foolish. When will academia embody responsibility?
Well, you know, that study was condemned for being outrageous. You know, you're not even supposed to expose corruption.
No.
You know, the long tradition going back to the Sokol hoax, you know, of pointing out the nonsense in academia, and that did a really good job of exposing the ridiculous quality of a lot of it. But then people have done serious studies to show that this is the case. You know, I mean, James Tooley and Derby did a report in 1997 on educational research that said most of it was politicized in an incomprehensible jargon that nobody understood, that was useless to practice, and the research on it was weak. So wherever you go, there's hundreds and hundreds of journals. And I think part of the reason we have so many of these journals is because of exercises like in England, the research excellence framework. You have to produce more and more research, you know, and you get these little empires of research. So, you know, you can feminist research, gender research, and you know, if you're a feminist, you never publish men, and it has become an industry of nonsense, really. And I think, I think it has to be challenged, and I think, you know, that was a really good expose. But interesting, the authors of that report, you know, and the Helen Pluckrose in particular, is still being vilified to this day, and personally vilified, if you follow her on Twitter, you know, by thousands and thousands of people hate her, and hate her personally because of that. So it was a brave thing to do, but we need more of it, I think.
I think what the paper I remember was about the patriarchal oppression by dogs in parks.
Yeah.
That's just beautiful.
Oh yeah, and don't forget the use of my fellow German or Austrian landsman Adolf Hitler from Mein Kampf, which was changed a little bit to be a feminist paper.
Right.
I would like to ask a question from Douglas Wallace. He writes, and I think he miswrote something. He asks, in talking of battle of ideas, you mentioned that academics are missing and that this is a good thing. I have issues with the United Nations listening to teenagers telling them off when those children can't know a fraction of the facts instead of paying attention to the various expert views. Would you explain why it is bad to those who are presumably experts not to be involved in battle of ideas?
I think that was a misunderstanding of what I said. We shouldn't be being told by children who don't know what they think yet what we should think. Right? So the whole point about debate and debating matters competition is, you're still developing your thoughts. You're only 16, 17, whatever. But you're used as an emotional blackmail. At every conference I go to, and you'll find that somebody will wheel out a young person and almost patronizingly get them to defend the views that they've set them up to defend. If you talk to young people, they can see that they're being patronized. The interesting thing about the Battle of Ideas and this Battle of Ideas at Buxton is we had a lot of people who came from the north of England, from Manchester and Yorkshire, and they weren't the typical university audience. So they were more working class. And I think they were desperate to speak. There were a lot of people who had a lot to say, and it was really exciting. So it was really dynamic. So it was just that normally when you have a conference in a university, lots of academics come and lots of students. And this audience was largely made up of, if you like, ordinary people. Not entirely, but it was a different audience. It was a good audience. And they weren't, they may have had different political perspectives. They may have had different backgrounds. They were a very intelligent audience. So that, they could challenge. They were really good. So it was an exciting audience. It was a different audience. It wasn't by saying that, I wasn't saying I was rejecting academics in the audience. We'll encourage more academics to come next time and get a debate, because we need to have more debate with academics. So I think ordinary people are more keen to have debates than a lot of academics are. I hope that clarifies it, Douglas.
We come on to a question from Steve Moxon, the author of the brilliant book, The Woman Racket, 2008. If you don't own a copy, correct that as soon as possible. Dennis, Steve writes, isn't it when the ideological nutters in government overextend, e.g. a hate law, specifically concerning speech targeting females, that the whole thing is vulnerable to collapse under the weight of its partisan absurdity?
I think they do, but they respond to pressure, don't they? I mean, everybody now demands a law banning whatever it is they disagree with. Misogyny is likely to become a hate crime in the not too distant future. And that's because certain pressure groups are fighting for it. I mean, I don't believe that in a sort of, that the governments are competent. I don't think they sit around and think what policies we should have in a sensible way. They react and do impose stupid laws and regulations upon us. It's my take on it. I'm not a believer, in the European Union is a really competent organization. It's as reactive as any organization and largely made up of bureaucrats who are not noted for their intellectual abilities. So I do think, you can argue about whether, Dominic Cummings brought a different slant into government. And it is occasionally some of their advisors do. I think when Cummings was an education advisor with Michael Gove, I think he had a good influence at that time because he could say something about government. But I don't think it's not government imposing these things. They're responding in a superficial way to pressure and from who can make the loudest noise, really.
Okay, next question from Sally Ann Burris. Have you got thoughts on the dependency on the mental health and fitting people into boxes?
Well, when I first started looking at the rise of therapy, it was about people's self-esteem. You know, you have low self-esteem. You know, you have lack of resilience, and you have your well-being is being threatened. It's just a new way of seeing the world. So there is no mental health problem, and it just does not exist. There are some people who are ill, that's true, but and you could argue that lockdown did a lot of damage to people's mental stability. But there's something else is happening, is that, and the way I see it is that ever since the 1990s, the only way government relates to people is because they haven't got anything really important to offer them. It's to treat them as vulnerable and to get them to see themselves as vulnerable. And that is why you get this, everybody's describing themselves as mentally ill. So I don't think there is a mental health problem. So I wouldn't try and deal with it in that way. So to get people to stop thinking of themselves as having mental health problems is the best way around it.
Could I say that in regards to the boxes, I have noticed, obviously right now we have this huge increase, transgender or demisexual or whatever sexual. And I think it starts with puberty, because people are going through an identity change, and it is always good to fit into a box. In the past, I think society provided norms, and norms are boxes. And now these children don't have norms as boxes anymore. And the abnorms are the new boxes that give them extra power, as you said earlier, and mental health issues are another one of these boxes. And I think that our society delays maturity and delays children's adulthood, so to speak, or our adulthood. So I think young people take these boxes, these mental health boxes, or sexual identity boxes, or racial identity boxes into university. Do you think there's some truth to that?
Yeah, well, two things really. One, I think the reason that people become obsessed with their physical bodies, and it is a terrible thing when you're going through puberty, because you're unhappy with your body. Everybody has experienced this sort of thing. You don't know what's happening to you. But when you have a world where you can't change anything, you just seem to be, individuals can't change anything. The focus inward is change your body. You see it on a very trivial thing, like people tattooing their bodies. Changing your body because you can't change the world seems to me the move behind this. And I think it is tragic and terrible for, you remember that Bath Spa University refused to fund a research project on, or an MA in research on retransitioning. So it's a one-way system. But I get out quite a lot, into where I live is a fairly working class town, and you don't see people with problems of identity. You see boys doing the same things they've always done, and groups of girls doing the same scary things they've always done. The idea that they see themselves as vulnerable when they're storming out of school, try and meet the 10 girls you bump into down the road, or the boys. So I don't think it's a general problem, but it is for specific groups. So I think it is related to where you're going. So if you're going to university and you're looking for a job, and it's, again, we're going to be part of the new elite, then these things become important to you. And I think you'll often find it's not always, but quite middle-class families where they have these traumatic issues with their children.
I would like to counter that, because I live in a tiny village in the far north of Scotland, and I see in our secondary school already this identification with sexuality happening. I had discourses with teenage girls in regards to transgender identity. So unfortunately, I have to disagree. The boys are not affected by that for the most part, but the girls are, because they are more part of the school life. The boys try to leave school as soon as they can at the age of 16, because they don't see any value in school education anymore. So that a little bit of warning that it's already happening in working class areas as well.
Yeah, I'm not saying it doesn't happen at all, but just, I live in a big area. There are lots of people here, and it's quite different. I mean, it is quite a case. I know boys who are transitioning, girls who are transitioning, people who are not sure, and I know some terrible things that happen to young people who transition and get supported by every institution. So the teachers support them, social workers support them, so on. I mean, I was tempted to say Scotland, has a different approach to bringing up children. I remember that appalling thing that was going to be introduced of having a named person with every child.
Yeah.
That indicates a real interference with parenting. And that was a terrible part of it. But that happens generally with schools and in most of the institutions as well. The idea that they're going to tell you what's true. So there is certainly within professional institutions, people will encourage this, and you're probably seeing it there as well.
Mike, would you like to read the next question?
Yeah, an interesting question as always from Sean G. In retrospect, Dennis, do you feel the expansion of higher education after the Labour victory in 1997 was wise?
Well, I'm very positive about people, so I don't mind how many people go to university. Everybody should go to university, get the chance. The question is not that people, and there was a mass expanse, I mean, I've had debates with students who've laughed at the fact that their postman has an English degree. I think everybody should have the chance to get a good education degree. What happened is they expanded education, the number of students going, but what they were going to was a con. They didn't get the quality of education that they might expect, because most students go to university because they love a subject, but instead, they got a watered down skills-based curriculum that I've written about, this structured around learning objectives and make everything easy for everybody. So it wasn't a good quality education. So they didn't go to university and immediately have all their ideas challenged in a traditional way and have a knowledge-based curriculum. They had a curriculum that had already adapted to what I've called many times the therapeutic university, and that's what they got, and it didn't do them any good. And they often didn't do subjects which were in the traditional liberal education syllabus. So a lot of things went wrong for packing them in. But I think you could have offered everyone a good education, but that would mean changing the minds of university academics and the people who run universities. And we've made this point many times that 50% of people employed in universities are not academics or teachers anymore. They're managers and HR departments, fostering all the sort of things among students that we've been talking about today.
I would actually like to give a little jab into capitalism, unfortunately, here, even though I'm absolutely not against capitalism, but I saw it in regards to television programs. In the past, in Germany, we had the ARD, and which was C of Germany, and the quality of reporting was very high. It was very good, and then it was open to private TV stations, and from that point on, the quality of television just rapidly declined for the lowest common denominator, and where television could have been educational and could have raised the knowledge of housewives that are watching TV in the background, it actually became dumber and dumber and dumber. And there is an area where I actually would have liked to see the protection of higher quality knowledge protected in some ways.
If you remember, there are two great series produced by the BBC called Civilization, by Kenneth Clark, and Mikowski's The Ascent of Man.
Jacob Bronowski.
Bronowski's The Ascent of Man, yeah. If you did that today, it would be The Descent of Man. Yes. So people don't have the faith in people anymore. So I think it's part of the fact, it doesn't matter whether it's commercial or privately owned, it's it'll be represented as something that's pathetic, something that shouldn't have gone on. You see it about the Russian, if you take the Russian Revolution, it was always presented as a triumph, whatever you think about communism, of people, and now it's presented as people's tragedy. So whatever it is, you look at it as it produced people who are victims, essentially. So the new interpretation, so I think there's an ideological thing, but it's not necessarily the capitalists or non-capitalists to do it. I mean, even vigorous capitalism has gone. I mean, capitalists don't even like capitalism anymore. So, you know, I think that's a change that is really hard to understand. Because they can't even be vigorous capitalists and want to have profits and produce things anymore. You know, they'd rather do something.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up shortly, and I would like to bring two things together because I think we can bring them together. One is from the chat. Sean G says, Stephen Crowder, whose politics I don't share, looks like, oh, boys, sorry, we're taking me down. Stephen Crowder looks like Socrates to me, sitting at a table in the street outside of colleges, engaging enthusiastic students in vigorous evidence-based debate. So that was just a statement. And then Douglas Wallace wrote, you often talk of debate in terms of for and against. Is there no place for discussions? Take him out. Sorry. For discussions of issues without always making them into a dichotomy. And I think Stephen Crowder has a great debating style, which is very much for and against, but he listens to the other person's argument. What are your views?
Yeah. For relaxation, I read Plato. So, you know, in different dialogues, there are different views of debate. So sometimes, you know, Socrates is really harsh. If you take the classic one, the Apology, you know, where his life is about to be taken, but he attacks. You know, he's ruthless attacking. And then in other dialogues, like Protagoras, and you know, he's much more discursive. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a matter, you know, and he does discuss the different sorts of you know, of debate that you can have. And I think if you're with your friends in a house, as he was in the Protagoras or in, you know, in the Gorgias, there are different ways in which you can have a debate. So it's not always threatening. It's not always confrontational. But I just make the point is there's so many people who don't want confrontation at this moment in time that it's better to emphasize, you know, for and against when people just don't want that. And I think we have to make a case at this moment for more rigorous debate of that nature, rather than otherwise everything will collapse not into a gentle discussion, but into just self-expression that's never challenged.
And I think, Dennis, we'll have to wrap up there. I'm sorry to say. Thank you for a most interesting hour. Really, really fascinating. And so my thanks to you, Dennis, and I hope we'll see you next year again.
Thank you, and thank you for the great questions, everybody.
Yep. Thank you, Philip, for another day's great co-hosting. Really, really appreciated.
My pleasure. I'm going to look after the dogs now.
Yes, okay. If we hear a couple of shots ring out, we'll know how you dealt with the problem. But you better kill them first time, because they'll kill you otherwise by the look of them. Okay. And my thanks to all the attendees as always. I'll be back at 7 a.m. tomorrow morning with Sally Ann Burris. We have an early start tomorrow, the things we do for you people. And we'll be interviewing or have a live Q&A with Anil Kumar, who's a very important Indian MRA who spoke at the London conferences I hosted back in 16 and 18. So it's goodbye from me, and good night from everyone else here, I think. Right. Okay. Thanks, everyone.